There are a lot of good seats down here in the front. Students are the same everywhere in the world. Well, I'm very happy to be here, and it's just it's a bit of a coincidence because I was working at the Truman Library and I happened just to drop a little note to Stephanie Kilton saying that I was in town and maybe we could catch a drink or something. And it turned into, she's not here, okay, but I'm working. So, and I asked Matthew, she put Matthew, I guess, to work in organizing this thing, and I gave him a bunch of choices of different things that I had been talking about. And he chose fundamentals of shadow banking and said that he particularly wanted me to talk a little bit more about the dealer model that I had talked about a bit in the MOOC. And so I have tried to create a talk that is about that. Let me just say, just to orient you to sort of who I am a little bit, this is who I am. Okay, the bottom two books are my first two books on the history of monetary economics in the United States, the money interest and the public interest, and the history of the rise of modern finance through the life and times of Fisher Black. I put Stigum on top of that. Okay, this is how I taught money and banking for many years. Okay, this MOOC is basically turning Stigum's money markets into a textbook, into something you can teach undergraduates. And I learned the mechanics of money markets from this book. If you want to learn the mechanics of money markets, buy this book. And then on top of that is A New Lombard Street, which is my most recent book, which makes the world aware that I've been teaching money and banking and thinking about money and banking for a long time, and has something to say about the financial crisis. Princeton Press asked me to write this book. I suppose if you just looked at my publication record, you might think I was nothing but a historian of thought. Not that that's a bad thing to be. But in fact, this was always my attempt to develop some ideas for how to think about modern money, combining these three things. And so I'm pretty proud of New Lombard Street, and I can recommend that to you too. It's short, it's 150 pages. And if you sign up for the MOOC, you can get a free PDF of it from Princeton Press. No resolution. So there's the MOOC that he was mentioning. So I have an announcement. I just decided we're going to run it again starting May 25th. You can sign up for it now, and you can look at it. It's all there. You can see everything. But it's more fun to go through it where 2 lectures are revealed every week. And so we're going to do it again. There's 60,000 people who signed up for it now. And so everyone who signed up for it will get an email saying, if you really want to take it and get sort of a certificate, now's your time, May 25th. Since the book and since the MOOC, I've done 2 more things, which I think Matthew has distributed to you. And I'm going to come back to this to orient you. I've developed this way of thinking about money, which I call the money view. We can come later, maybe in discussion, to how this connects with other approaches to money. But for me, the question was how to connect it to capital markets. So, in other words, finance, modern finance. And that's what I sort of did in this Badger Was a Shadow Banker. That's what we're going to talk about today. And also how to connect it with foreign exchange, with other money markets. And that's what this other article is, Essential Hybridity and Money View of FX. So both of those 2 things were developed sort of after the course. And you have them, those are the most 2 recent things that I've done, and they're, I believe, distributed. So what is this money view thing? The money view, I say, there's sort of 2 ideas in the course that I teach. One is understanding banking as a payment system. I think probably you will have learned that yourself, although no doubt there are nuances and differences there. Because I build on the American institutionalist tradition in this regard, Morris Copeland and Hyman Minsky. And so some of you know about that. I'm not going to talk so much about that today because Matthew said you wanted to know about the dealer system. And that's mostly the second big idea, which is understanding banking as a market-making system, understanding banks as a kind of security dealer that are making markets in money. This comes much more from the British central banking tradition, and that's what those names are: Hawtrey, Hicks, Badger. This is the British central banking tradition. And I'm not going to, again, talk about history of thought at all, but just to give you some idea where some of these ideas come from. It's important for understanding, so there's 2 images here, just because I can't teach you the whole course at once, but here's one. The hierarchy of money and credit, sometimes I call it the natural hierarchy of money and credit, and I get into trouble, so I just say hierarchy of money and credit. in which there are layers of best money to, from money to credit, let's say, gold under a gold standard, currency is a promise to pay gold, deposits a promise to pay currency, securities promises to pay deposits. The important thing for today is to appreciate the middle column there, which is saying that in between each of these layers, there's a class of institutions of market makers who are linking the best money with the less good money, and they're going long and short. They're making par relations between them. Even we're used to thinking that currency and deposits trade at par, right? If you put $1 into a bank, they give you $1 worth of a bank deposit. If you cash in your dollar bank deposit, they give you $1 in cash back. We take that for granted that there's an exchange rate of 1 between these two kinds of money that are actually issued by two very different kinds of entities. Okay, what I'm going to unpack here a little bit is what is the institutional structure that makes that work. Okay, there's a dealer there that has basically got a bid-ask spread that they're willing to go either way, depending on what you want to do. That's what I mean by taking the security dealer's image into the world of banking. So security dealers are making markets between securities, bonds and stocks and things, and money. Banks are making markets. Central banks are also making markets between their own domestic currency and some international currency. We don't see that so much in the U.S. because the international currency is the dollar. Okay, but this is the idea. And there are the three prices of money, just as a sort of to remember. Exchange rate, par, interest rate, these are the three prices of money that are being made in this way. I'm not going to have anything much to say about the price level, okay, which many people think is the essence of monetary theory. This approach suggests that these three prices of money are where you want to start, right? That's the hierarchy of money and credit. I mentioned here, because I know Stephanie's talked about she has some other slightly different notion of the hierarchy of money, and so when I say things, I just want to make sure that you're not confused that I'm being clear what it is that how I'm using these words anyway. And we can come to how other people use the words in the discussion. An important thing because I want to talk about the financial crisis, an important thing about this hierarchy is to appreciate that it is dynamic, okay? That it is fluctuating all the time, and at every time scale. Overnight, okay, in the clearing system, weekly business cycle, and also the rise and fall of nations, okay? And I'm just showing you that fluctuation, showing that there's very little of the best kind of money, okay, in existence. In fact, in my little pyramid, there's zero, a vanishingly small amount. It could even be virtual, and it's all credit, it's all inside money. In my world, all money is inside money, because we're not in the gold standard anymore. And the point about this fluctuation over a business cycle, let us say, is that there's fluctuation in all layers of the hierarchy. So there's expansion of credit, there's expansion of bank money, there's expansion of state money, and then in the collapse, we find it contracts and it gets narrower, this pyramid. That's what I'm showing a boom there. And which in a boom, what happens is that lower orders of money suddenly seem more money-like, and also there's more of them. So I'm showing quantity increasing and also quality increasing, okay, during a boom. And in a crash, it's the opposite. Okay. Why am I talking about this now? It's because, remember, dealers are key people for knitting together the layers of the hierarchy. So they come under enormous pressure when you have a contraction of this hierarchy, because they got one leg in one level of the hierarchy and another leg in another level of the hierarchy, and suddenly they're getting squeezed. Okay, and so the pressure on the system, the place where it breaks or where it is at the level of the dealers, all three kinds of dealers, okay, that we're talking about. So I'm going to show you that. So that's just to remind you again. So there's these three kinds of dealers, it's a hierarchical system. This is my model, if you will. In the real world, there's many more layers. It's much more complicated than this. This is actually a model. And this is about the boom. The bust, of course, is just those arrows reverse direction. Okay. So I've been saying things about dealers. This is for you, Matt. Okay. What do we mean by dealers? Okay, what do we mean? I'm using the word quite generally to refer to security dealers who deal in equities and bonds. That is to say, They quote a price at which they're willing to sell and a price at which they're willing to buy. Apple stock or the bonds of General Motors. But I'm also going to use the word for banks, who I will call money dealers. And they're making markets not just in currency versus deposits, which is where I started there, but also in forward markets, in term deposits as well, particularly in the Eurodollar market, as we'll see. And there's also foreign exchange dealers who are kind of money dealers, who are exchanging one kind of money for another, again, spot, term, and forward markets. And I'm also going to use the word dealer to talk about people who trade these derivative instruments, various kinds of swaps, interest rate swaps, credit default swaps, foreign exchange swaps. Again, they are making markets. They're creating a bid-ask spread that creates liquidity. What dealers do is to supply liquidity, supply market liquidity. And that supply takes the form of being willing to trade. They say, you want to buy? I'll sell. You want to sell? I'll buy. You want to convert this kind of money into that kind of money? I'm your man. You want to convert it the other way? I'm your man. Okay? That's what I mean by market liquidity, is the ability to buy or sell at your choice quickly without moving the price and in volume. Okay? So this is a sort of finance definition of liquidity from that point of view, and I'm bringing it into money. That's what I am mainly trying to do. I know some of you read this Trainer article, maybe. There's a whole literature in market microstructure in finance, which I have read a lot of. I use Trainer because you can teach Trainer, and it's a very simple model, and you'll see that you can really play wonderful. It's very intuitive, I think. So that's what I mean by dealers. Now let's build a little intuition about this. Most people have never known a dealer, okay? At least of these kinds of instruments. Let's start with a dealer that you do know, okay, which is a supermarket. Okay, supermarkets are a special kind of one-sided dealer, okay, in the sense that what you see on the shelf is only the price at which they're willing to sell this good to you. You don't see the price at which they're willing to buy from you because they're buying wholesale. They're buying somewhere else in the system. So they're taking goods from one place and moving to another, buying wholesale and selling retail. And I use the supermarket example because people have intuitions about supermarkets. This story maybe works better in Manhattan than it does in Kansas City. But so the question is, we see throughout the day in a supermarket, okay, that sometimes the supermarket's really busy and people are in there and the goods are flying off the shelves, and sometimes there's nobody there. So in other words, supply and demand are not lined up in time, okay? And yet the price doesn't change. The price stays the same during the day. Even though sometimes people are really eager to buy and sometimes they're not. How do they do that? How do they achieve that? Supply does not equal demand in that market. The dealers are absorbed in fluctuations with inventories. That's what a supermarket is. It's an inventory. It's an inventory of goods that is there to absorb the fluctuations in demand. And they fix a price that they're willing to sell, and they absorb fluctuations in demand on their own balance sheet, on their own stock of inventories. They're changing inventories into cash during the day. And then at night, in Manhattan, a bunch of trucks come and they refill those shelves. They come from New Jersey, they refill those shelves, and they do it again the next day. Okay? So this idea about the key role of inventories for stabilizing prices, okay, is the point. Suppose, though, that one day there's a little bit of a scare, and people say, you know what, all Tylenol is poison. The Tylenol that's on those shelves, okay, is not going to be sold. Okay, it is going to, for any price, okay, because demand has just disappeared. So the supermarket is going to lose money on that inventory of Tylenol. That's the point. That there's risk associated with holding these inventories. The risk being that the market price might change on you while you're holding those inventories. That's not so important for supermarkets, perhaps. Particularly, they can control their inventories. But it's quite important for other kinds of dealers, particularly in financial markets, because those prices can move fast. Okay? And so this is a kind of risk that we need to be oriented. So that's to build your intuition about dealers. So far so good? I see nodding. The whole idea now is to take that intuition and move it to two-sided dealers, okay? To security market dealers who are buying and selling, who can have long inventories and also short inventories, okay? They can sell things they don't own, okay? They can borrow it and sell it with the idea of buying it back later when supply returns, okay? And that's security dealers, and banks are like this too. Banks, and most of these dealers I mentioned on the previous slide, are two-sided dealers. They use inventories to stabilize prices, and in doing so, they take a risk, and they supply liquidity. So that the risk that they're taking has to be compensated by the bid-ask spread and by changes in prices. That's what the dealer model is understanding why that this is a profit-making business, these dealers. Right? They're not doing this because they say, isn't it a wonderful social service to provide market liquidity to people? No. This is a business. They're just like a supermarket business. They're providing market liquidity, okay, for a price. Okay? And that's the profit of the dealers. And that's how we can develop a theory of dealer behavior. Right? So we can now, to think of dealers at all, by the way, so this is just a little parenthesis for this particular audience I'm imagining. Standard economics, okay, Laurasian general equilibrium economics, okay, has no dealers in it. Supply and demand are meeting, and there's a clearing price, a market clearing price. There's no dealers in it at all. Okay, they're abstracting from all the mechanisms of the market. Okay, and maybe for some purposes that's a good abstraction. For understanding money, it is a terrible abstraction because those mechanisms, as I've just been trying to argue here, are the essence of the matter. Okay? If you abstract from those, essentially what you're assuming is that market liquidity is never a problem. Okay? The market liquidity is a free good. That any time you want to buy or sell, there's always somebody to take the opposite position, some actual person, not a dealer. You don't have to pay anybody for this service. It's free. Okay? That's how it works in standard general equilibrium theory. And I think that's one of the reasons why understanding financial crises, understanding the mechanisms of the monetary system is so hard for economists, okay? Because the abstraction that you start with and is hammered into your head is not helpful. It's just not helpful at all because you've abstracted from this set of problems. This is deeper than just saying, oh, they don't have a theory of crises because they don't know about uncertainty. This is all true too. But it's even more fundamental than that. Okay, there's no theory of markets there. That's the point. There's no theory of how market exchange actually is facilitated. Personally, I think I would like to have a money view of supermarkets too. That's the next thing I'm writing, and that will give you a theory of the price level, I think. Okay, but we're moving on to that. So here's just some data, just to give you an example. Every week, the government security dealers report to the Fed what their balance sheets look like, and this is, and you can find this on the Fed's website. This is what they look like in March 19th, 2014. What security dealers are doing is buying assets and buying a bond, say, and then financing it overnight in the repo market. So they use it as collateral to borrow overnight in the repo market. Does this thing have a laser pointer?
Yes.
Oh, that was the wrong thing to do. Does it come back on if I press it? Yeah, there it is. Which is the laser pointer? It's that one. Okay. Okay, fine. So there's repo. So that's a liability of the security dealer. They're borrowing 1,418. That's in billions. So that's $1.4 trillion. Okay, in overnight and maybe weak loans that are used to finance security positions. Okay, and if you go short, you lend money and you borrow securities, so that's there because it's lending money. I'm treating that as an asset, reverse repo, and that's $1.2 trillion. These are very large amounts of money. Okay, this is much larger than M1, M2, M3. This is the wholesale money market. Okay, that's to give you just a sense of what we're talking about. I put down here just as a notation the net outright positions they report. This is their outright holdings of treasuries, government this is Fannie and Freddie, mortgage-backed securities, corporates. They have all positive positions at the moment, it seems, not negative ones. I wish there were some negative ones so that you could see that inventories can be negative. This is where the price risk comes in, okay? That if those things fluctuate in value, okay, these dealers will make money or lose money. Often they're on both sides, so they will be long treasuries and short corporates, so they're betting on spreads. It's a very refined business, but this is just to give you a sense that there's data out there to mess with if you're interested in going the empirical route. Here's the theory. So this is the trainer diagram that some of you, how many of you have had a look at this at all? I'm not going to call on you. You can admit it. Okay, yeah. Okay, a few more hands went up. See, I've been teaching for a while. So here, this is Jack Trainer in 1987 published this article in the Financial Analyst Journal. He was a friend of Fisher Black's, which is how I found this, and this was very influential for Fisher too. This is a very simple little model that thinks of the dealer as having a maximum long position here and a maximum short position here, okay, based on their tolerance for risk, their own capitalization, their ability to borrow from a bank, whatever have you. Okay, there's some story that says you can't go long, you can't build up inventories longer than that, and you can't go farther short than that. Okay, so that explains the horizontal axis. Okay. And then there's the vertical axis, okay, which is the prices of this. And you can see there's value-based bid there, and there's value-based ask here. Okay. Those things come from outside the model also. That's Warren Buffett, if you're talking about stocks. Okay. That if the price gets low enough, Warren Buffett is a buyer. Okay. If the price gets high enough, Warren Buffett is a seller. Okay. Maybe that's 30% away from the fundamental value if you're talking about equities. If you're talking about treasuries, it's much less. Okay, so it depends on the market that you're talking about. That's the outside spread. That difference between the value-based bid and the value-based ask is the language is the outside spread, because that means if the dealer stops making markets, okay, if the dealer for some reason says, "That's it, I'm done," it's the outside spread that determines everything. Okay, if there's an imbalance in the market, if there's an imbalance in the market on the supply side, prices collapse and they go to here. If there's an imbalance on the demand side, they go to here. So that's the point. That if there were no dealers, we would see more price fluctuation than we do, and it would be it would be more like houses. Okay. Housing prices, there aren't any dealers really in housing. You know, there's just brokers. You've got to find somebody to buy it. Okay, it's or find a house that you're willing to buy, and it can take a while. And if you need to sell in a hurry, you need to discount your price, okay, by 10% or 20%, and people do. And if you need to buy in a hurry, you're not going to be buying at market value. You're going to be buying at more than that. So the dealer is, these are the quotes of the dealer here, depending on his inventory. That's how the model works here. That if you have a higher positive inventory, okay, you quote lower prices. Okay? If you have a higher negative inventory, you quote higher prices. And the higher your inventory, the lower the price. What does that mean for economists? It means that if I have a positive inventory of this stuff, I'm willing to add to it if I can get a better price, if I can buy it at a lower price. Okay? If I have a negative inventory, I'm willing to get even more negative if, in fact, I can establish that at a higher price. So I can get my short on at a better price, because there's price risk. What I'm hoping to do is to buy low and sell high. You know, to buy here and to sell up here. Okay, walk up that ladder. So there's risk associated with this, and so so the reason that line hits there is because of the value-based bid. The reason that line hits there is because of the value-based ask. And so it's a closed model. It tells you stuff about how this works. Oh, well, unfortunately, the email version of this carved off some things that were on the next slide. Maybe if we take a break, I have it on a I should have checked through to make sure. I can tell you what was on this slide. okay? And then, what was on this? It was just written by hand on this slide. I added in firstly 0 right there, okay? That's matchbook, okay, where you don't have any price risk. You know, a dealer can have both, well, particularly this is important for swap dealers, because very often they have very large long positions in a swap and short positions in a swap, and they might have matchbook on net. So they don't have any price risk. They have counterparty risk, they have liquidity risk, but they don't have any price risk, okay? So Trader's model doesn't really talk about that kind of dealer. It's talking about people who have the net exposure. One of the things you got to do to move this model into money land, okay, out of finance land, okay, is to talk about the risk of matchbook dealing. So that's why I put 0 there. The other thing I tell you is, if suppose you have a positive inventory, the important thing is that that inventory has to be financed in some way. So if you have an inventory of treasuries, you have to have capital, or you have to be borrowing from a bank or something like that. So there's a link because of that between funding liquidity and market liquidity. If your financing goes away, if you can't borrow anymore, you have to liquidate your inventories as a dealer. And if you liquidate your inventories, what does that mean? No one's making markets. And what does that mean? You're back to the outside spread. That's what a financial crisis is. That's what a financial crisis is. So this is a theory of dealers as profit-making entities that is consistent with a collapse in prices that's caused by a pure liquidity problem. Of course, there's solvency things that could happen too, but the liquidity part is what I want to emphasize here, because, as I say, that's exactly what's abstracted from in most economics. There's not even a way of thinking about liquidity, really. It's like money supply and money demand. What is that? You know, this is not about money supply and money demand. You can see that, right? This is about supply of market liquidity by profit-making entities. That's the supply. Okay. Where do central banks come in? So I was just talking about dealers. Central banks are dealers. Typically, however, they're not profit-seeking. Okay. If they're agents of the state. In many cases, central banks were originally bankers' banks, and they were sort of profit-seeking, but Bagehot made us aware that the Bank of England had to be public-spirited, at least public in terms of banking. In a time of crisis, it had to lend freely at a high rate against security that would be good in normal times. That's the Bagehot rule. Okay? So central banks are different than other banks in that they're concerned about the stability of the system. They also sometimes have responsibilities to the state as a primary client. So I'm saying, what is the relationship between central banking and the dealer system? In wartime, that relationship is very clear. Okay? In wartime, the central bank becomes the government's bank. Okay? The government has to win the war. The government has to issue bonds, and it can't sell them. The people won't buy them, or they buy them at too high a price. It can force the banking system to buy them. It can force the central bank to buy them, and that's what the central banks do. This is not illegal. Okay, it's standard war finance. It was done in World War II. It was done in World War I. It was done in the Civil War less well because there wasn't an official central bank then. Every country does it. Okay, it's a common thing. And here's what I'm showing you. How does so in a way you could say that in wartime, the central bank becomes the dealer of first resort. Okay, they set the inside spread. They say, here's what it's going to be, and here's what the price of that debt is going to be. And if you don't buy it at that price, I'm going to buy it at that price. And that's what I'm showing here. This is the Fed, okay, buying bills and bonds of the government. This is the government issuing bills and bonds. And the way that happens is just by an expansion of the balance sheet of the Treasury and an expansion of the balance sheet of the Fed at the same time. It's a balance sheet operation. Where's the free lunch come from? The free lunch comes from the fact that the liabilities of the Fed, the Treasury can spend. It can spend them for war material, it can hire soldiers, it can win the war. That's the idea. Okay? This is all, the Fed can do that today. Okay? This capacity is there. And one of the things that has caused our political economic crisis that we're experiencing now is that basically is what the Fed did, except that its counterparty was not the Treasury, okay, its counterparty was the private sector. It used this operation for private bailout in that dimension, and that it was never supposed to do, okay, and was never imagined that it would do. So that's caused a little political crisis. What it was imagined in peacetime that it would do is this. This is the second thing. That it should be serving in peacetime as the sort of backstop of the system. Not making the price, but being sort of the outside spread, being the Warren Buffett of the banking system. Okay? That if prices get too out of whack, the central bank will come in. And in particular in short-term money markets. Okay? So it's stabilizing the Fed funds rate. What does that mean? That means if the Fed funds rate gets out of some band, the Fed comes in and is a buyer or a seller to keep it in that band. That's an outside spread type activity, okay, that the Fed is doing. So I say that, so the sort of other way to think about what central banks are is that they're bankers' banks. Notice that this doesn't have anything particular to do with the government, okay? Providing that outside spread facility, Warren Buffett does it for the equity markets, the Fed does it for the money markets, okay? It's a private banking function. The dealer system creates the price. The Fed merely backstops it by accepting government debt at the discount window when things get hairy. Now the important thing for understanding normal times is that indirect support, that support for the government debt market winds up providing indirect support for the non-government debt market because there's arbitrage relations between different kinds of bonds. And that's what I want to show you here. So this is the term structure, just showing you the money sort of overnight, treasury bills is 3 months or a year, treasury bonds 10 years. The Fed is messing here, okay, and that gets translated into prices here and here in normal times through arbitrage, through trading, okay. But the important thing that I wanted to say about this indirect thing, that's indirect. Typically, the Fed is not intervening at all maturities. Right now, it is intervening. Okay, but typically it's not. But that also gets translated into this interbank rate. I'm just having the Fed funds stand for that, and into this sort of capital market money rate, repo, and there are relations between these 3-month commercial paper, 3-month C&I lending, so forth. So there's a maturity structure in the capital market. There's a maturity structure in banking. All of these things are related to what the Fed is doing in supporting the government bond market, even though it's not doing it directly. And then here's the international part of it, that the Fed makes no representation that it's going to support the value of any other currency. It just says it's going to keep the international dollar and the domestic dollar at par in the spot market. Okay? The international dollar is a private dollar. It's a euro dollar. It's abroad. Okay? And then there are exchange rates between these. There's a whole credit system built underneath all of these, the hierarchy of money. So this is the first part. Saying, what are dealers? And it's preparing you now for the fundamentals of shadow banking. This would be time to ask a question, or shall I? We're only 35 minutes in. Shall I at least start to give you the payoff? Okay. The payoff is that this is supposed to tell us something about shadow banking. It tells us something about lots of other things too, okay, I think, okay? But what we want to talk about today is shadow banking. What do we mean by shadow banking? Now here's another word that I'm going to use in a way that is probably different than you've heard before. Because there is not one meaning of this word. People use it in lots of ways. My definition of it, and I think Matthew distributed that paper, Badgett was a shadow banker. This is the definition in that paper. Shadow banking is money market funding of capital market lending. Not Jimmy Stewart banking, which is in all your textbooks, which has deposits funding mortgages or something in a local community. This is money market funding, so it's wholesale money market funding, and it's a market price, okay, that is being determined there. And capital market lending, here we're talking about like securitized mortgages, which are like bonds, which trade, and their price fluctuates over time. So there's a market on both sides of this balance sheet, and that market is determining these prices. Okay, the money market price, the price of funding, and the capital market lending, that's the price of risk. This is a global funding market. That's very important to appreciate, okay? That the dollar funding market is the global funding market. If you're a Portuguese small businessman and your bank won't give you credit, this is what's happening in Portugal now. You can conceivably your loans can get packaged with somebody else, get securitized and sold, and they're funded in the global dollar money market. Okay? So it's global dollar funding of local, possibly non-dollar lending. Market pricing on both sides of the balance sheet. That means, okay, now here's the payoff. When you say market pricing, that means there's a dealer somewhere. There's a dealer somewhere that is making those prices. That's where prices come from in financial markets. They come from dealers. It's true that people are the ultimate demanders and suppliers are thinking about their risk preferences and they're trying to anticipate the future and all that sort of thing. But where the price comes from at the moment of transaction is basically a dealer. In a liquid market, there's a dealer. That's what makes them liquid. That's also why the central bank is key. Because the central bank is the ultimate backstop in the funding market, okay, in the money market. Okay. That's why the central bank wound up being the backstop of the shadow banking system. Now we're going to see this in detail. So this is just to give you an image, to begin to build some intuition about the modern financial system. Okay, that just everything you know about Jimmy Stewart, just put it away in a little box for the moment, okay? And imagine a world in which it was all like this instead. Okay? I think it is much more all like this instead, okay? Which is why I'm starting with this. It's not that Jimmy Stewart is in fact completely dead, okay? But he's inframarginal. You know, that's not where prices are determined. Prices are determined in this world, okay? And crises are too. So what am I showing here? This I'm calling them a shadow bank. And I'm showing there a foreign exchange risky asset, okay, capital market lending, being funded in the overnight repo market or 3-month market or something, and that's a dollar funding. So that's shadow banking right there. On any balance sheet you see that, okay, I want to call it shadow banking. Maybe it's on some conduit, okay, maybe it's on the balance sheet of Union Bank of Switzerland, maybe it's on the balance sheet of Citibank, maybe it's on the balance sheet of the Fed. It's shadow banking. It's money market funding of capital market lending. I'm showing these other 3 entries here too. These are new. Credit default swap, interest rate swap, foreign exchange swap. So here's the idea. This doesn't really exist in the world. This is a model. Okay? We know that in the actual shadow banking system, it's all this tranching and all this credit transfer stuff that all broke down in the crisis. So I'm imagining a world in which none of that stuff breaks down because it's done with a derivative that's very transparent and everyone knows what risk they're bearing. Okay? And so I'm saying this shadow bank is swapping out all of the risk. Swapping out the default risk, swapping out the interest rate risk, swapping out the foreign exchange risk. That combination of 4 positions is like a synthetic treasury bill, okay? A risk-free, short-term security. That's why you can fund it in the overnight money market, okay? It's a nice security. Okay? The mirror image of the shadow bank is over here, the asset manager, and I'm showing this asset manager as investing in, as holding all of their capital in the money market, in the wholesale money market, as collateral for its derivative positions. And these are its derivative positions in credit default swaps, in interest rate swaps, and foreign exchange swaps. So you can see it's just exactly the mirror image of the shadow bank there. I have a sort of accounting convention here that puts these on these sides of the balance sheet, not the other side of the balance sheet. You could argue to do it the other way around. As long as you're consistent, it doesn't matter, but it can confuse people if they're not aware that this is a convention. People aren't used to putting swaps on balance sheets. Okay, I think we need to get used to it. There's a lot of this stuff out there, and it's been booked off balance sheet, and that's part of the problem. So I'm proposing a accounting convention. If you don't like this, make up your own, and then we'll all agree, and then we'll be able to put it on balance sheets and be able to talk about the real world. Now I'm adding another layer.
I said money market funding of capital market lending, that means there's a key role for market making institutions, which is to say dealers. Where are the dealers? There are the dealers. I'm putting a global money dealer in between the capital funding bank and the asset manager. So imagining that there's a bank there that is collecting in the wholesale money market all kinds of funding, and then it's distributing it out to various sorts of investments here. Okay? All big investment banks are doing this. All big global banks are in this kind of business here. Okay? Standing in between, now I'm calling these deposits, okay, not repo, and I'm calling this capital funding bank instead of a shadow bank. And I've gotten rid of the foreign exchange, just to simplify it a little bit. But you can see that it's the same thing. Here's that global money dealer thing. Has been around for a long time. Okay? Mostly it's been about countries like Korea, okay, funding their development activity, okay, in local currency, long term, okay, with short-term dollar borrowing from the global funding system. So the financial crises of the Asian financial crises and the Mexican financial crises, these are also crises, in retrospect, of the shadow banking system. We didn't see them because we thought they were just currency crises or something like that. The funding system that was developed for that, okay, is now by now been through a number of cycles, so it's pretty robust. Okay, this part is the new part. Okay, carving off all of those risks and moving them around. Okay, this was done for mortgages, for U.S. mortgages, and I'm showing RMBS is residential mortgage-backed security. Okay. In effect, what the shadow banking system did was to try to carve off the default risk, carve off the interest rate risk, and sell them to somebody who was willing to buy them over here. Okay? And there was the investment banks were kind of in this business, derivative dealer business, in making markets in those risk exposures. Okay? That's where those prices came from. But these markets were not deep. They were not robust. They had not been through another crisis. This was their crisis. This is when we found out what was most fragile about the system, and it was these markets that were most fragile. But they're connected with the money markets because derivative dealers have to fund themselves. This diagram is in the Badgett paper. Badgett was a shadow banker paper. Oh, here I want to say, think about this. Some people ask me, oh, okay, so which one of those is Bear Stearns and which one of those is AIG? I think I could talk about that, but most of the big investment banks are actually in all four of these businesses. Okay, so you can't quite do that. Put labels like this. The purpose of this diagram is to create a functional differentiation, understand how the system works. There are specialized functions that are in only one, or only this one, or only that one. They do exist. But most of the big banks are to some extent in all of these businesses. This is meant to be a guide to regulation, for example. I'm writing a paper right now about that, okay, saying, instead of trying to regulate Credit Suisse, okay, observe that Credit Suisse is in each of these four businesses. And each of these four businesses involves exposure to a different kind of risk. So let's make them do their accounting so that we can see those risks. And then treat each of those functional boxes in a proper way. Okay, so that's where this goes in the regulatory kind of language. And there's a central bank version of that as well, which we probably won't get to today. But. So these are the fundamentals of shadow banking. Oh, this is here because people sometimes think, oh, shadow banking is just banks lending to banks, it doesn't do anything real. And there is a lot of intermediation in the middle. That's certainly true. But I want to just remind you, or maybe not remind you, but to assert, and this comes more from the other side of my money view, the payment side. Okay? Where does credit come from? From a payments perspective, okay, credit always arises from imbalances in cash inflow and cash outflow. If I am spending more today, okay, than I'm taking in, then I am accumulating due tos. I'm a deficit agent. Okay? If I'm taking in more than I'm spending, then I am accumulating due froms, okay, from the system as a whole. These are deficit agents and surplus agents in the payment system. I want to emphasize this doesn't have anything to do with savings and investment. Okay? It's not about intermediation necessarily, because I'm not saying that this deficit agent is running a deficit in order to acquire a capital asset. No. Maybe he just wants to consume. Okay? If he's consuming, then this saving and this dissaving cancel out. Okay? And there's no saving in the system. But there's credit. There's credit expanding. Okay? And anyone can be in that. So this could be the private sector, businesses, business debt, it could be household debt, it could be government debt. And the financial system is, I shouldn't have put the word intermediation, but I did. Okay, is standing in between the surplus agents and the deficit agents. We see this in the clearing system overnight. You know, it's trying to settle, okay, in the clearing system overnight. Stuff that doesn't get settled gets pushed off till tomorrow, or next week, or 10 years from now, or in the case of mortgages, 30 years from now. So the credit system is built on top. Is really just an elaboration of this due to, due from payment system. So, shadow banking may fund real activity. It may not fund real activity. We don't know. You need to look at the real activity. It's funding surpluses and deficits, as credit systems always have. That's the point of this slide. It's to say, that's what credit does. Shadow banking is doing what credit does. It's the modern financial globalization version of credit. Okay? Not your grandmother's credit. Your grandfather. Not to be sexist. So here's a little example of what could go wrong in the system. And then, do we need this? Well, maybe I'll say this, just to put some concrete numbers on it. Where there could be vulnerability in the system. So I'm showing credit funding bank. This is the same slide as the previous one. Global money dealer, asset manager, derivative dealer here. Okay, and I'm putting numbers, and I'm saying there's $100 worth of residential mortgage-backed securities, which are funded with $100 worth of money market borrowing through the global money dealer over here. Okay. And I'm saying that there are these swaps that are created that at the moment of creation has zero net value, or zero value. And so that's why there's all these zeros, okay? We're hedging this risk, okay, by shifting it over, but it's not clear when this hedge is going to come into the money here, in which case you'll be glad that you insured against it because your house burned down, okay? Or whether it's going to come into the money here, meaning these mortgages don't default, and so the asset manager gets extra return, okay? So we don't know at the moment of inception. This is one of the weird things about swaps that's sort of mind-bending, you know, that they're zero net present value instruments at inception. So this is at inception. This is sort of rigged here so that there's $100 worth of capital and $100 worth of risky assets here. So in a certain sense, all these risky assets would go to zero, and there should be no effect because it's just that capital goes to zero. Somebody just made a big loss. All the risk is over here. All the capital is over here. It's rigged to be like that. There's no solvency problem in this little model here. Okay, by design. That the capital and the risk are all in the same balance sheets, and I'm assuming that all the legal structure is there to make that go. But there's liquidity risk because here's another slide that I drew on a little bit. So I will have to tell you what the drawing says, and I'll just give you the proper slides later. What do I draw? So here I'm showing a value fluctuation. So there's a fall in the price in the value of the residential mortgage-backed securities from 100 to 90. That means a rise, okay, in the credit default swap, okay, because I'm thinking of this as being default premium, not interest rate changes, okay. So that goes to 10. That goes to 10. So there's this incipient loss here of 10. On the liability side here. The problem is that will the global money dealer continue to roll over this funding? If they were using the residential mortgage-backed securities as collateral for this borrowing, they now have $90 worth of collateral and they need to borrow 100. They're not going to roll this over. Okay? In Bagehot's day, the CDS was attached to the RMBS, okay, so that the total was 100, and you could roll it over. In modern days, they're not attached; they're separate, okay, and so that's some of the problem. There could be a funding crisis here, okay, because the global money dealer refuses to roll it over. There could be a funding crisis somewhere else, where the derivative dealer here says, okay, you know, Capital Funding Bank, you owe me 10, let's have that 10. Let's have that 10. Or there could be a funding crisis here. The derivative dealer says to the asset manager, you owe me 10, let's have that 10. The asset manager says, well, I can do that, I can pay you, but that means withdrawing these deposits, and the whole thing could come unglued just for liquidity reasons. Okay? Just for liquidity reasons. And there can be, unglued means a liquidity downward spiral, fire sale. If you can't fund yourself, you have to sell your asset. If you sell your asset into a market where no one wants it, the price is falling even more, the problem just gets worse. It doesn't solve the problem. So there can be, and so that's why there's a role for a lender of last resort to the global money dealer, to these dealers in the middle, to maintain prices, to maintain the continuity of prices. Not to support prices, but to maintain the continuity of funding markets and of risk markets. And there's potentially a role for the central bank as dealer of last resort for the underlying risk exposures and the underlying assets as well. That, of course, is exactly what the Fed did, okay, in the crisis. Yeah, so there was a beautiful slide there that you're not seeing. So now I'm going to tell you, apply this more specifically using the trainer model to the shadow banking boom and bust. The story I tell in the Bagehot paper about the boom is the following. It had to do with asset managers, okay, having money, capital, okay, wealth, that they want to invest, and they want to invest, but in this particular way. They want to hold more cash positions, okay, and they want to have more risk exposure here. So what do they do? What do you do if you're that sort of agent? You find a money dealer and you say, here, hold this cash. And you find a derivative dealer and you say, please give me this risk exposure. And the dealer says, okay. And they take that position onto their balance sheet. And that's what that looks like in the trainer model. On their balance sheet, these are sloping up, not sloping down, because we're talking about yields, not prices here. So money market, here funding. This is the funding yield. So this is the money market funding price yield, and risk dealers. So these are the risk premia. Okay, they're both in yield terms. So you can compare them, and you can see that the push of asset managers has knocked our dealers off of matched book, okay, and given them a net exposure, which they respond to by changing the prices they quote. Okay? They're moving down the funding rate, and they're moving down the risk premium. That, if you will, distortion of asset prices creates an incentive to create a shadow bank, and that's exactly what we got. Shadow banks that say, look at that cheap funding, okay? Let me fund some assets here, okay? And when a shadow bank is created, remember, the shadow banks are the mirror images of the asset managers. They take that exposure off the balance sheet of the dealer, both of those, off the balance sheet of the dealer, and it snaps back to matched book, and you're ready to do it again. And that is basically what was going on in the buildup of these exposures, that there's this imbalance created by money flow into the dealers that flows then out onto the shadow banks, and then it flows again. That's what it looks like on the way up. Somebody's raising a hand. Yes?
So, when those shadow banks get created, and when you're talking about shadow banking, like, where do those dealers, and do they exist within, in institutions, like I'm just trying to,
Yes.
I'm trying to follow with you now. It's like, now that you're talking about the actual system of the shadow bank, it's starting to fall apart.
Yes. So this is a model, right? So it's an abstraction, and now you're asking, where am I going to see that in the actual world? Okay, and you're going to see it in a number of places. okay? In fact, it's useful to compare this model, okay, to that big, you've probably seen it, this big chart that Zoltan Pozar created of the shadow banking system, okay? And to ask yourself, which of these things are doing the risk dealer operation? Which of these things are doing the money dealer operation? And so there's some of these are like warehousing operations. Mortgages have been issued, but they haven't yet been securitized, and they have to be financed. And there's warehousing of various kinds. Some of this is on the balance sheet of investment banks, that is to say. Some of it's on the balance sheets of hedge funds, okay, that are taking short-term positions for a fee. So there are a number of different entities. This isn't the important answer to that is to say there isn't sort of one entity that you can say you did it, okay? Either here, okay? These are distributed. This function is distributed in various institutions around the financial system. I'm trying to bring it up to consciousness and saying, once you know what the balance sheet looks like of a risk dealer, go look for it, and you're going to find it. Day traders, maybe you're a day trader. Day traders are basically giving intraday liquidity, you know, and supporting the system.
So do you view it more as like is it more of an entity or more of a function, or is it just?
It's a function. It's a function. It's a function. That's what the boom looks like. The boom works because profit-seeking entities create shadow banks to absorb the imbalance on the dealer's balance sheet. What happens the other way? What happens the other way? So now this is just the collapse of the shadow banking system. Okay, when a shadow banking finds itself in need of funding, it needs to roll its funding. Okay, it needs to roll its derivative exposures. Okay, and no one is immediately available to take that, and so it goes to the dealer system. That's a supply of risk exposure. That's a demand for funding. And that, if you started from a matched book position, that is pushing you in the opposite direction. Okay, in the opposite direction as it was before, and so that has an effect on prices. All very fine and good, as long as the dealers are able to absorb those fluctuations in supply with their inventory capacity. Okay, if that demand exceeds the inventory capacity, then you have a problem. Then you're back in outside spread world. Okay, as we were talking before. What happens in the crisis, though, is that when these prices move away from the matched book level, okay, what happened in dealer after dealer is that their funding limits, their exposure limits got contracted. They got contracted. Partly because banks that were funding them withdrew their funding lines, partly because they themselves said, we don't know how bad this is going to be, so we're going to stop doing this anymore. We're not really sure. And so these position limits get shrunk, and so you have these excess exposures. And the dealers are scrambling, and they are collapsing. They're losing money, and the markets that they were making, they're not making anymore. So there aren't any prices. There's no price for these asset-backed securities. Okay? During the crisis, the AAA tranches, okay, were selling at 50 cents on the dollar. To this day, most of those tranches haven't missed a single payment. Okay? But they were selling at 50 cents on the dollar. No one was sure what they were worth. There was no one making markets in them. There was no one coming and saying, I'm a buyer at 80, putting a floor on that system. Until the Fed did. And that's what the Fed did. That's what caused the Fed's balance sheet to balloon. I'm going to come to that in a minute. But the Fed, of course, is not the dealer of first resort. Those dealers are the dealer of first resort. And so if we think about making them more robust, so we're starting to get into the regulatory stuff here, okay, we certainly want to make sure, my idealized model was one where there is no solvency risk. Of course, in the real world, there is solvency risk. So you're going to want to have then some risk-absorbing capacity there. And you're going to want to have some, some liquidity reserves here as well. That could be backup lines of credit with banks or something like that. Or it could be holdings of liquid securities. In practice, they held very little of either of those things. What they relied on were puts to the rest of the system. I'm now focusing just on liquidity. There was liquidity puts to the banking system, basically the traditional banking system, for both of these dealers. And that means Citibank, okay? That means Union Bank of Switzerland. That means AIG in case of some solvency goes. And those had puts to the central bank. So this is the system that was in place before the crisis. Okay? There were these derivative dealers with implicit, and global money dealers. Now this also has gotten screwed up. They're not quite lined up the way they should be. They had puts to the rest of the system. That's what these are here. And traditional banks had puts to the central bank. And so when the thing came unglued, the shadow banking system winds up on the balance sheet of the central bank. Not the whole thing, but just enough to put a floor on the crisis. And that's what this slide is showing you. This is the balance sheet of the Fed, December 15th, 2011. So this is after the crisis, or at least the part of the crisis that I'm talking about here. And you can see what it looks like, okay? There were treasuries, mostly long-term treasuries, 1.7 trillion. And there were mortgage-backed securities and GSE bonds of about $1 trillion. And there was a bunch of other stuff. And there was currency of about $1 trillion and these excess reserves of about 1.6 trillion. And you know that all of that is new. None of that was there before the crisis. What I am doing in moving from the left-hand side of that balance sheet to the right-hand side, okay, is reorganizing that data in a way that connects up with our model. Okay? I'm saying, think about those mortgage-backed securities and imagine that you added, they're risky securities, you added 0.9 treasury bonds on the other side. And also on the left side. So you're adding 0.9 of treasury bonds, 0.9 trillion to both sides. So 0.9 and 1.7 gives you 2.6. Now let's add 2.6 treasury bills to both sides. That's what that one is, and that's what that one is. Okay? And then let's consolidate currency and reserves. That's 2.6 trillion, and so you get this balance sheet here. All I've done is to add the same thing on both sides of the balance sheet. So it doesn't change solvency, it doesn't change anything. But by rearranging this, you can see that the exposures the Fed was taking on are what? If you have a long position in a risky security and a short position in a risk-free security, you have a credit default swap. If you have a long T-bond and a short T-bill, you have an interest rate swap. If you have a long T-bill and a short overnight, this is like an overnight interest swap. The Fed was, in fact, intervening in swap markets. It was not permitted legally to actually buy swaps. Some central banks are, as a matter of fact. Look at the balance sheet of the Swiss National Bank, okay, for example. But the Fed is not, but it is able to create synthetic swap positions, okay, by trading in the underlying. And that's what it did. Okay. And if you remember the previous slide, okay, we expect that it to be taking on some of these swap exposures in a crisis. And there they are. Now I'm just writing them as swaps using my notation. There they are. $2.6 trillion worth of OIS, 2.6 of IRS, 0.9 of CDS. Okay. It was that worked. I mean, we can talk about the political economy issue, but what the Fed was doing was backstopping the global shadow banking system. And it worked, okay? In the just sort of most minimal sense that you put a floor on this crisis. But I don't think the Fed knew what it was doing as it was doing this. This was not a conscious thing. This was cobbled together in the emergency, but it wound up behaving in exactly the way you would think it would behave if the shadow banking system is the actual banking system, and the Fed is serving as the backstop. That's what the balance sheet looks like. So this is our task. Task for me, but also for people younger than me, because I think it's going to take a long time. Okay? It's the challenge of financial globalization. I asserted, and I'll argue some more, that shadow banking has come about because of financial globalization. This is about capital market lending and money market funding. It's about global funding, okay, of capital market lending. The financial globalization, when I say that, what do I mean? I mean integration of capital and money markets. In most programs, and not yours, every program around the world, there's one course in money banking and another course in finance, and they never talk to each other. Okay? In the real world, they're completely integrated with each other. Okay? Shadow banking is where that integration happens. There's also integration of global funding markets. Okay? We talk often in macroeconomics, particularly in the United States, as if it was a closed economy or something. Whereas in fact, all of these money markets are global. Okay? There's a world interest rate, and there's arbitrage between one currency and the other as funding currencies. Both of these things create big challenges for our understanding of central banking. It's not just that the Fed did this big thing, dealer of last resort. Okay? It has to rethink all of the dimensions of central bank from the beginning. Regulation supervision of this new shadow banking system, and money and credit policy as well. So I think we are in, some people said when the crisis happened, we're in a Minsky moment, okay? This financial crisis of the shadow banking system. That's right. But now I'm saying we're in a Bagehot moment, okay? This is Bagehot. This is my copy of Bagehot. Maybe you can't see this very well, okay? This is Lombard Street, a description of the money market, okay? And down at the bottom it has pounds, shilling, pence, okay? So this is a book written by Walter Bagehot in 1873, in which he was, and that's where the Bagehot rule comes from. In a financial crisis, what do central banks do? They lend freely at a high rate against security that would be good in normal times. That's the Bagehot rule. Okay? We now see, and what he was pointing out to central bankers is, hey guys, this is what you actually do. Every time there's a crisis, this is what you do. Why don't you admit it? Why don't you say that you're going to do that? And why don't we build our structure, build our banking system around that knowledge that's what's going to happen in a crisis? And I think that was very good advice. The book was very controversial when it first came out. Moral hazard. They didn't use the word moral hazard at the time, but I think we're in a very similar moment now, where we need to appreciate that central banks are going to do this the next time there's a financial crisis. Because they're going to do this, we should rewrite the regulatory structures. We should rewrite the way we do monetary policy. Because if we're going to do this during a crisis time, we now have an interest in preventing these crises from happening in the first place. 1873 to the present, we built stabilization policy, we built prudential regulation, we got all the way to inflation targeting, building on Bagehot. That's pretty far, okay? I think mostly we're starting over and doing that same sort of intellectual work. Suppose we start with dealer of last resort. What does that lead to in terms of stabilization policy, in terms of prudential regulation down the road? I think we don't know. I think it's not obvious. This is some thinking to be done, some new economic thinking. I'll give a little advertisement for my history here. And we're trying to do it. This is actually the paper I'm writing right now, is Reimagining Central Banking for a conference just in 2 weeks. So it's a very exciting time to be doing money in banking, okay, because we're rewriting it from the ground up. And I could use some help. Thank you.